Steph Hilbourne OBE is a trailblazing leader and passionate advocate for the equality and the transformative power of sport for women. Steph is the CEO of Women in Sport. She's dedicated to breaking down barriers and ensuring that all women and girls can access the life-changing benefits of physical activity. Prior to this, Steph spent 15 years as the CEO of the Wildlife Trust, championing environmental conservation and leading significant campaigns for nature. With a wealth of experience in leadership and advocacy, there's a visionary driving positive change for both people and the planet. Steph, it is brilliant to have you here today on the podcast. And I think it's fair to say that in the time you've been at Women in Sport, which I looked up earlier on is just over 5 years, you have really transformed that organisation and the whole conversation around women in sport. What I really want to start the conversation with is, what has been your biggest challenge that you've encountered advocating exclusively for women and girls?
Hi, Holly, and really good to be here. And big question. I think where we're at now is that we've effectively got into sport as women. 40 years ago, when Women in Sport was founded, we were still excluded officially from a lot of Olympic events. We weren't even allowed into the pole vault till 2000. So it's sort of, there was actual total exclusion. Now we are largely in the room. Now we are allowed to play three of the biggest team sports that when I was growing up, effectively, I wasn't allowed to play football, rugby, cricket. So we're in the room, so to speak. And that's almost the first phase. And we need to go beyond inclusion to equality. And one of our core founders, Celia Brackenridge, has wrote that sort of 30 years ago. The first stage will be inclusion, and then we need to go for equality. So I think we're at that point. And I think the big challenge, it's a bit like I found in the environment sector, that once people realise there's a problem, getting them to realise that there was a problem was the first challenge. Then it's a much more subtle and complex challenge to actually address that problem and address it in the right way, come up with the right solutions rather than, it's a problem, so we're going to do this thing, which is, maybe actually not the right thing. So that's where I think Women in Sport is going to be spending its next 10 years, is really refining thinking and helping others to understand the experiences women and girls have, the culture and environment they're operating in, and with partners like you, yourselves, to actually work on proper, intelligent solutions to the issues. And I think the other thing is, this time, absolutely, we have to do this with men, because now we're in the room. We need to be joining forces with the men who are on our side and who truly want to see this equality.
I think that's a really interesting point you made there, Steph. And do you think that's why actually it's taken an awful long time to get into the room, but making progress now, I suspect, might be even harder, and certainly from some of the evidence that we've seen? And do you think that actually the unlocking of that is going to be men more than women? Or do you think actually we need women also to play their part in this conversation? Because sometimes I observe women don't always play their part and actually potentially advocate against in some scenarios. And I think that complexity, as you've kind of hinted at, I think is really real.
It's very complicated in the sense that we are all, men and women, the products, obviously, of our early years experiences and stereotyping. And, all women pretty well have aspects of misogyny inculcated into them. Every time my mother used to sort of talk about divorces, it was always the woman's fault. She wouldn't have actively thought that. She was part of women's lib, but you don't even know you're doing it. So certainly women don't always help other women. It's not necessarily deliberate. It's a bit like men aren't always being deliberate at all when they're not helping women. So I think there's an awareness raising issue about the subtler forms of sexism or misogyny that needs to reach women as well. And the likelihood is when it reaches them, they see it more clearly and more easily because they probably have experienced it. And it's less straightforward for a man to understand it if they've never experienced any form of structural inequality, which is why I think white men in this country have the biggest intellectual challenge to sort of engage naturally in this. But yeah, it isn't, we can't leave it all to the men. But the men will be fundamental. And, the good men, I mean, what our work in culture, the brief report we did on culture recently, a few years ago, showed was that the people working in sports who anonymously completed this study, who had gender equal leadership in their senior teams, supported the best culture. And that, on a number of measures, was better than the predominantly female leadership. It was a lot better than the predominantly male leadership. And our instinct, although this can't be proved, is that the men who are really with us feel much stronger about standing with us when there's more equal 50-50 in the room. And they almost feel emboldened by our presence. So, we really need to equip those what we currently call good men with, the ways to go about being allies, as we would call them, or at least to be agents of change on our behalves, as well as anything we can do.
You talked a lot about gender and representation and that 100% gender pool, but just picking up on a stat, which is obviously around board representation, in 2024, there was a decline in women being part of boards. Why do you think that it's gone down to 41% from in 2020, 43%? So you've seen a 2% drop in female representation at a board level. Is there reasons behind that?
We can only speculate on quite tight changes like that. I mean, I think certainly, if you look at the change in the FTSE 100 representation, the early part of the century, it was really quite dramatic, up from about 5% to nearly 30% women in boardrooms. The issue is that, certainly when I was at the Wildlife Trust, I met the only female chair of a FTSE 100 company at the time. It's the roles we're playing as well. And if we get into the boardroom, but we're never the chair, we're never the key decision makers in that boardroom or the chief execs, then obviously it's not going to be a particularly appealing environment to stay in. So and that's what, one of the big issues around coaching, as you both know probably better than I. The thing is, if you are very much the minority, that culture is really uninviting and really quite pleasant. You're not going to stay very long. There's also this whole, it's hard to say. With boardrooms, I think the data out there shows across the board outside sport that women predominantly hold the roles which are about counting up and looking after people. They're not about where to go, taking risks, or all the kind of driving aspects. And so, we might have women in a boardroom, but they actually might not be when they're going to be agents of change. So it's quite a complex picture, but obviously it's massive progress to get to nearly 50% in the boardroom, and critically we need that in the senior teams. But we tend to do a count whenever we can of the top 20 sports by participation to see how many of the chairs, chief execs and performance directors, who we would regard as principally the drivers of culture, are women. And that has gone down from 21% when we did it a few years to 17% now. So that is really very low, and in those top 20 sports by participation. You think, what's driving that as well? I mean, we want to start looking more into the glass cliff and to understand what, we know that around the world when women lead, they start their leadership having gone through a lot more anguish than an average man would starting that leadership. They experience extreme misogyny in leadership roles. It makes the whole experience far more exhausting. Your emotional energy reserves will run out quicker. And that's very much been the experience of certain women who we've known who've reached the top in the executive level of sport.
Can I just pick up on a point there, Steph? Because one of my observations is that, probably 15 years ago, I can't remember actually when I was a board member of Women in Sport. It's a while ago now. I'd have to count back. But certainly when I was around that table, women in sport were talked about much more clearly in strategies, in teams, through funders and others. I think what I mean by that is, what I'm seeing is that women are kind of in what I call a bucket of equality, diversity and inclusion. And actually, what I'm seeing happen is that, and this may contribute to some of the changes that we've seen, particularly in that UK Sport England board leadership report, is that actually, in order to get more diversity around ethnicity, disability around the table, potentially some of those seats that women were taking have come out. And there feels like there's maybe just this challenge for how many seats are there really around the table for diversity. And if actually trying to change that status quo is more complex from an overall diversity point of view. So that's my concern, is actually we're seeing just, we want to see 50% of women on boards, and we want those women and men to be representative of the communities that they serve, whether that's ethnicity, disability, faith. They're all really important, but I'm not sure that the thinking around recruitment and the understanding around that diversity is far enough advanced, or whether just actually some of the traditional white, middle class, middle-aged men don't want to give up those board seats, in terms of equality. So I just wonder if there's something almost slightly perverse happening in the quest for overall diversity and inclusion. Actually, big group of women who, by the way, are 50% of the population overall, are actually being squeezed out, which I know is maybe a sort of a slightly controversial thing to say, but I'm interested in your kind of thoughts on that.
Well, that is really, really good point. I think obviously there are layers, and it's pretty obvious really that half of any population around the globe, pretty well half, are men and half women. And then you have different ethnicities, disabilities, other layers on top of that. Which sex you are is a pretty even 50-50 split. It's not too confusing. And so in many ways, we don't think that the same sort of approaches you take to a minority community are particularly useful sometimes to get to equal balance between men and women. And just as the same thing's true on a sort of more legislative mega scale with how you approach proposals for, because we still haven't done legislation against misogyny, you might not use the same approach exactly as you would against other forms of discrimination. So we certainly challenge national governing bodies quite often on why they've put women, half the population, within EDI. We're very supportive, obviously, of getting far more representation from diverse groups, and not least disabled people as a whole, because you know how high that proportion is in the country, disabled people, and how completely unrepresented they are, but also ethnic minority communities. But it does feel odd sometimes to be sort of putting women in that section. Sometimes it's a conflict, and that's because of what I said right at the beginning, which is inclusion is good on nearly every count, except when it comes to protecting women and making safe places for women, when actually we have for many, many millennia really deliberately excluded men from certain situations, such as our sporting categories or places where we'll be undressing or everything else. So, and for lots of both social and physical and other reasons, just open inclusion actually reduces protection of women. And so there is an actually inherent conflict within that. But I think the real reason why sometimes it doesn't function is we're half the population and diverse and sometimes disabled. In every sort of layer you put on, there's always half. So
which is
it's odd.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why it makes sense in my head. And this is my comment, I guess, about thinking back to 15 years ago. You had organisations with a women's strategy, with someone leading that area of work. It had real definition, didn't always have the same amount of funding, for sure. In fact, it didn't. Yeah. But there was this kind of sense that women were a group, beyond as a 50% of the population. So I think it's really interesting, kind of the place that we've got to.
Yeah, I mean, I talked to a chap who's very involved in sort of corporate boards, and he said his take on it is that the boards are developing to keep 50% white guys and 50% of other people.
Everybody else.
And so in theory, that could be 50% women, but hugely diverse women and overrepresented from different diverse backgrounds, because the men aren't budging, the white men aren't budging. But I think you're right, that's not necessarily an accurate representation. And we obviously do absolutely want diverse women involved in boards. And that's a really interesting area of work to actually achieve that too. But the reality is, if you have, which our piece Dip Into Culture showed, if you have a gender equal leadership team, your attitude to inclusion across the board is the best. You're most likely to then welcome minority communities if you haven't already, or, that's sort of not already part of the bill, because you're actually functioning well in a balanced way, and you're not feeling threatened, and you're not promoting a negative culture.
Steph, we've talked a lot about boards and that general kind of representation at that level, but Let's talk about women's health and physical activity. And, we talk passionately about the fact that over the last 2 decades, women's activity levels haven't changed. And there are so many reasons for that. But what do you think are the root cause or causes why women haven't become more active over the last 2 decades?
I think I'm going to answer that as if you don't know what we all share as some knowledge. But I think we would always start right at birth, really, and work through, because, almost the moment, certainly when I had my babies, I had one of each, the behaviour of the midwife would be, oh, it's a boy, you can play rugby with it to the father. Oh, it's a girl, you can dress it up and make it look pretty, to the daughter. The stereotyping begins almost at birth. And that, the work we've done in the under 11 space with girls and boys, has shown it's incredibly alive and well, that we still say be careful all the time to our little girls when they're doing something next to a boy, do exactly the same thing and don't say it to him, and instill fear into our girls. We still are paranoid if our boys would start school without being good at football, that they'd be bullied and wouldn't be part of the gang. And so we skill them up, and we don't skill our girls up in balls, to throw, kick, catch, etc. So we're starting off with, obviously there are exceptions, but in the main part, boys arriving at school not as good at writing and fine motor skills, but much better at sport skills. Girls starting much better at writing and crafts, but not so good with handling a ball, and throwing them together without really thinking about that on a playground and into mixed sport for the whole of primary school, and then being marginally surprised that by the end of primary school, girls' self-belief is halved and they're put off sport. And then that's before the onset of female puberty, which is not exactly joyful in many cases, and before the onset of the worst experiences of social media, which also hits then. So I think that even even outside school, all those stereotypes are taking place too. And that means we know that we've got an adult population of women, most of whom didn't enjoy sport when they were young, some of whom come to it in midlife. But the other thing we're inculcating in girls from the moment they're born is that their job is to look after everyone else and their needs come last. And I think that's the most fundamental thing that is so cruel, because what it means is your happiness doesn't matter. It's the happiness of people around you that matters. And in the end, sport's about joy and freedom and the absolute opposite of responsibility for others. So, you put all those layers on, and by the time you get to midlife, you're responsible for everyone and everything. You're burdened with that responsibility. You're responsible for the old, the young. You're responsible for, your own job, which you now have, who we may not have had 40 years ago, but then we were going mad because we weren't allowed them. And that is just burdening you down. You're still doing an hour and 50 minutes on average more housework than a man in the same situation. And, a day. So your free time is hugely limited. And you might know perfectly well that it'd be really good to take exercise and do stuff, but the majority of women would really struggle to do that. And hence, as you say, you talk about health inequalities, gendered health inequalities, which are not talked about nearly enough. You have this, disastrous rate of osteoporosis of 1 or 2 women suffering it, and compared to 1 in 9 men. We don't even talk about that. We don't talk about the fact that 80% of sufferers of autoimmune conditions are women, and the link that has to oppression and stress. It's not talked about. Why would it be? Because it would mean society would have to change, and our lovely boys and men would have to do a bit more housework. So it's, it's uncomfortable, isn't it, that sort of change? So, yeah, I think we would put it in summary down to the difference, down to 2 things. 1, stereotyping, and 1, biology. Because in the end, our biology is different. In the end, starting your periods, having to work out sports bra, it's going to add a barrier. Whatever we do, we need to do a hell of a lot more to support it, but it does add a barrier. And in the end, if you give birth, that's a bit of a big moment. And go through menopause is quite a dramatic moment. So there is the biological stream, but there's also the stereotyping, which has its different burdens at different ages. And our mental health as a sex is just dramatically worse than men throughout life. And with these awful peaks now in the late teenage, where, we've got the girl guiding happiness stats are so just dreadful. So sport has got to be a really important centre of thought for everyone who gives a monkey about women and girls and their happiness, because it's at the centre of things.
I think, Steph, one of the things that you've done well as an organisation in over the last couple of years is to really try and help all of us that are working in this space, and I think more broadly out to the networks, understand some of these nuances, and the nuances which are actually quite fundamental to how we're structured. Because so fundamental, what you've just said there is that mum guilt is programmed in at birth, right? So yeah, so that's like, how do you change
daughter guilt, I would add.
Yeah, so all those women out there kind of going, oh, I know I shouldn't feel guilty. I don't want to feel guilty, but I do feel guilty. It's like reprogramming, isn't it? I guess for those women who are really struggling with some of those things that are leading to them not being as active and therefore not as well mentally and physically. I think for me, joining the dots with some of the work that you've done, there was 2 bits of information you guys put out, which was a real moment for me. It was an aha moment, not in a good way. But that data around and that understanding about girls dropping out at school, around school sport, and that's happening at 16, 17. They are becoming those women that are in their 50s, of which 1 in 2 are breaking a bone due to osteoporosis. And a bunch of other health conditions that women are kind of experiencing, all of which could be reduced through physical activity, sport, strength training, a whole raft of these kind of things. And I think, wow, that is pretty shocking, isn't it? And by the way, it's 2/3 of girls almost, isn't it, dropping out?
I mean, the bone health stuff, I must admit, I didn't know that much about. 5 or 6 years ago, I didn't know that we put down like 90% of our bone mineral density by the time we're 18. And that being a very active teenager whilst consuming enough vitamins and calcium in particular is the best thing you could do for your later life, because you're putting that bone density down. Obviously, you do need to keep that up, and particularly around the post-menopause. But, I took my very elderly mother to the clinic for her bone scan a couple of years ago, and they said, well, she's got long bone density of a woman 10 years younger. That's great. I said, would that be because I hope Mum never, she won't listen to this, because she was a quite overweight child, but who nevertheless played quite a lot of tennis. Oh my God, how do you know that? Are you a medic? I was like, no, I'm really not a medic. But it just shows how important that is that a bone expert would say that. So for sure, we are sitting on a time bomb if we have a lot of young girls who are also not eating well, not eating enough of the right minerals and vitamins, and who are not taking exercise. And yet the teenage research we did showed that we worked out it was 1.3 million girls give up sport in secondary school who used to like it in primary school. And for sure, you can't say just because you like sport at school, you carry on forever. I'm an example of someone who, has kept swimming, but hasn't really kept up a lot of the other sport I loved at school. And there is definitely a segment of midlife women who didn't do any sport at school, who absolutely realised what they missed out on, and quite angry, actually, that they missed out on it. And one of the things we say when we just talk to individuals about this is it wasn't you, it was the sport you were dealt. They say, I hate sport, I'm not sporty, I wasn't. And if you say, no, think about it, you might have been. It's just you were given the most dreadful experience of sport you could ever imagine, as most people, I'm in my 50s and my age were. Get stripped down to your knickers. Did the boys do that? No, they wore shorts. Go out in the freezing cold wearing virtually nothing when you're more sensitive to the cold than the male. Be worse than the boys, but get thrown on because you never be trained up in anything in any way. You're not strong.
It was the rubber hockey shoes that got to me, and the blue pants. I'm just saying.
Mine was the navy knickers, and I remember that when you went through puberty, it was okay that when you started your periods, what you could do is you could really broadcast it by wearing a white game skirt. So that's a great thing to do, isn't it? I mean, it's just years of memories like that we all share.
Hideous. They're really hideous. And I expect you were both so into sport that you kind of just went through it. But anyone even remotely did think, why would they go through that humiliation? You just wouldn't, would you, if you had the chance?
Well, I used to be called the girl that had bulletproof pants, bulletproof knickers. Yeah, because I used to play hockey, and I was relatively okay at it. And yeah, that was I don't think it was particularly complimentary, actually, that I was called the girl with the bulletproof pants. But yeah, I remember playing cricket when girls didn't really play cricket.
Yeah, exactly.
So the only way I could play was actually in the boys' cricket team. And it was just so difficult. It was almost humiliating at times. They didn't want me to be there. I didn't massively want to be there. It was always a battle to be as good as you could, which is so much pressure. And I always remember this story of going to a cricket pavilion at another school. And of course, there was no toilets for me. So I had to go to the toilet behind the back of the pavilion. And I remember doing that, which is fine. Well, it's not fine, but it's what it was.
Fine, yeah.
Yeah, got on with it. But the worst thing was, I remember going out to the crease because I was about to go on to bat with my cricket bat in my skirt because I had no other choice. But of course, I had my skirt tucked in my knickers, didn't I? And somebody, of course, had to tell me that. And it was just the worst possible kind of moment. You know, when you're that age as well, I was probably about 14, I think, if sort of from memory. So thankfully, I carried on playing cricket. And I'm sure there's millions of those stories all of us could tell, which is not good.
And it's hideous. And the main awfulness, really, and cruelty of the deliberate exclusion of women from so much sport, and particularly team sport, is that, we did miss out on team sports. So, the team sports on the telly, we weren't in them. I mean, I've never really particularly reflected on it, but I remember I was good at team sport and ball sports. So I wasn't brilliant at tennis. There was a moment I was quite good at forehands and volleying, but I wasn't ever consistent. But I remember thinking, I'm never actually going to be good enough at tennis to win Wimbledon. So that's the end of my dreams, because there was zero female team sport on telly. You just couldn't dream to reach the top of a team sport. Every boy, and still every man, dreamt of reaching the top of the team sport. We were literally not given that opportunity to dream.
Yeah.
And it's so cruel. And so now we're still in that situation where there's 21% fewer girls and boys playing team sport. And going back to our earlier conversation, the skills you learn through that, the leadership, the camaraderie, the joint endeavour, the learning to lose together, to not blame a colleague who's mucked up a game, to not be blamed or to be blamed, and to survive it if you muck up for the team. All of that risk taking, and that, you just don't learn that any other way. I mean, it's a sort of quite a basic thing that, largely a way higher proportion of men enter the workplace having had than women. And, I do think some of the sports women were encouraged to do, and I was really bad at gymnastics, but, some of them involved risk and, fear boundaries if you got good. But I mean, not until you got to the point where you're flipping on a bar or something, which not many girls got to. So we just had our personal development so limited, so many girls did. And, it's just for no reason, especially something like cricket, which, at times women have been massive in cricket, haven't they? My ex's mother played for county cricket for Warwickshire and taught him to bowl a googly. And then he was brilliant at cricket, and someone said, "Who taught you that?" He said, "My mum." And it was like, everyone fell over. But then I would have loved cricket. That's the one I'm a bit twisted about, actually, because I wouldn't have probably been any good at football. I might have been all right at rugby. But I would have loved cricket, literally never even suggested.
It's interesting you both talk about, it's interesting you both talk about team sports. And for me, as I grew up, I mean, that was my worst case scenario, being in a team sport, because you had to be supportive and help everybody. I was a swimmer and I loved being in that place. But I was that kid at school, again, that I was put in probably the geek box. I would turn up
I thought you'd be in the naughty box. I was going to say.
No, I wasn't in the geek box, I have to say.
Yes.
I can't quite get my head around that.
No, but, this is going back to those kind of formative years. I would always turn up with wet hair. People would go, "So you go swimming before you do that?" But I think picking up on the point around
that early morning sort of
yes.
Okay.
I think that's just the weird box, not the geek box.
Yeah.
I just think you got the whole terminology.
I was always really impressed by that, lot of swimmers.
Yeah, but I guess for me, and if you talk about the correlation, it taught me resilience, it taught me accountability, it taught me everything. And I think I listened to what you say and some of our other guests, and we talk about the formative years are so important, that when you get to probably the age of 5, you are on a trajectory of somebody that will enjoy being active or not. I grew up as an expat kid and was thrown in the water and loved it. And I think that you start to form thoughts and opinions. And coming back to your 1 in 2 women that obviously break a bone due to osteoporosis, is myth busting and such bad knowledge that's out there. Women think that they're going to bulk up if they do strength training, but if they do strength training, they're going to be so much more powerful in so many ways. How important do you think the media is in being able to give women the right information to empower them to say, I am going to prioritize myself and I am going to do something, because if I do that, I'm going to be a better mother, I'm going to be a better friend? How important do you think the role of the media and social media is to give women the right facts?
Gosh, there's so much in there, Mel. I think in many ways, the solution to freeing up adult women doesn't lie with the women, it lies with the people around them. And I remember somebody telling me a story of how they got their parents or their in-laws to babysit one night so they could, go to the gym. But the in-laws didn't know that was why. They thought they were going out for a meal with a friend. So when they arrived and they were, oh, brilliant, I go to the gym now, and they said, we didn't come over so you could do something like that. As if,
wow,
the value of that didn't exist for them. They didn't have a right to actually have fun and do anything for their body. They could have fun maybe with a friend in a stereotype way. The people around us, I think a lot of the programs, just go back to the issue about how do we find the right solutions. We've got a problem of women not being equal in society. Does that responsibility lie with the women? No. It lies with the people around them, the people who are making them. Of course, some of those are women. So in terms of the media, again, I think it's almost cruel to lay another responsibility on women, which is a responsibility to try and throw out something that's been inculcated in you since birth and actually is possibly impossible to throw out, rather than a responsibility with men in their lives, on the men to recognise the vital nature of that for their partner and actually pick up a bit of the slack, do a bit of housework and encourage them to get out, or of a society as a whole to give them more freedom, of employers to think about this a bit more, of other people to actually recognise this gendered health crisis and this, to get a shift to actually, the only people who basically care about middle-aged women are other middle-aged women. I mean, that does bind us together a lot. But people only care if we completely fall over and therefore can't support them anymore.
Yeah, and I guess just picking up on that, No, I think it's good, because I think, what you're talking about there, a couple of conversations that we had, is there is this gendered health problem. There is it's recognised globally that there is inequality there for women around health. We know there is huge inequalities there around things like activity, sport, in so many kind of different ways. And in just that conversation with young people in schools, we could have probably sat here and done another 3 podcasts on all of our school stories about sport and activity, and so could every other women. And actually, I don't think there's lots of evidence to suggest that a lot has massively changed for the young girls and women in school, because we're still seeing 2/3 of them drop out at that age. So something is still not changing in that sort of ecosystem. And I think same for women, we're not seeing women's activity levels increase at a good kind of growth rate. They're kind of static pretty much. Why do you think we're failing to make the progress that we need to make? Do you think it's simply a lack of investment or programming, sort of social reprogramming, or something else you think that's going on? What do you think is really driving our lack of progress on some of these issues?
These are such big things, aren't they, Ollie? I think that this is so deeply rooted in culture that it does take generations to shift it. I think that interventions like your own, the stuff you do, the actual opportunity to go choose something, take part in something that genuinely feels for you, is important, because all the other barriers are there. So if then, a woman actually gets, managed to break free of these shackles and goes to, say, a leisure centre and thinks, what's for me? And then sees, an over 50s swimming session where actually everyone's over 80. That's not for her, is it? Or goes to a session led by a really macho young bloke. That may not be for her. Some women like that. But, so having definitely the right opportunities, everything else around you when all these other barriers are there. Sorry, everything else around you is stopping you. So if the opportunity is absolutely perfect, it might seduce you into it. But until, you actually start to get more awareness. I was going back to your point, Melbourne, when you said about the media, there were loads of thoughts that came to mind. And of course, one of the massively positive things that has happened is that we've actually let women over the age of 30 stay in broadcasting roles, which is monumental. We mustn't forget that we were basically sacked when we stopped being sexually attractive to blokes in a really dramatic way, with short skirts and everything else, from going on telly. But now adult, properly grown-up 50-something women like Davina McCall and others are actually talking about issues that were never talked about and are the voice of, women in their midlife, which we never, ever had when we were growing up. So some big positive things are changing media-wise. That is really important. Obviously, having some coverage finally of women's team sport in sort of free to view is an amazing change. That is shifting psyche. There is a shifting psyche with our dream deficit report we've done now for 4 years, which was 13 to 24-year-olds. Do you ever dream of reaching the top of sport? For 3 years, the overall result was about 30% of girls, young women girls did, and about initially 60, dropping a tiny bit to more like high 50s of boys did. So massive dream deficit. This year we did it, and it was the first proper uptick. It had gone up like 8%. To 38% of girls. And so it's so interesting that even straight after the Lionesses' victory, we thought it would have jumped right up. What had happened is it had jumped right up amongst the very small proportion of girls who were already madly into sport. And that's brilliant. They could actually dream. But it had almost disenfranchised the other girls because it seemed so distant to them. So but there have been some definite improvements because we've got this dream rate rising. There is this amazing stuff on telly. Obviously, the Lionesses led that in the 22, but also the Red Roses. And this year, that would be really exciting. We've got proper grown-up midlife women able to talk about women's issues and talking about it on telly. That's amazing. So these are all massive media benefits. We're still at the point, obviously, where the press coverage is 1,000,000% men's football and, tiny bits of women. But it was one of the most lovely moments of our sort of 40th anniversary year. Random thing happened, which is my mother's neighbour came round one day and left a newspaper on the table at mum's with a little note saying, "Steph, I thought you might be interested in this." I was going to visit mum once a week, so I found this thing. I thought, But actually, it was the newspaper from the 18th of May, 1984, on the day that Women in Sport was founded, with an article by Derek White talking about the first meeting. Wow. And she had the whole paper, which had been in a loft, wrapping up a vase. So looking at that whole 1984 huge broadsheet paper, I opened the 2 sports pages and it was so interesting. There was more horse racing than any other coverage by column inch. Then there was soccer down the sort of left side. Only, maybe twice as much soccer as cricket, men's obviously, men's rugby. There was a column about badminton talking about Helen Troke, as if everyone knew who Helen Troke was as like our best female badminton player. But apart from that, it was what Jenny Thomas, who's involved with us, said, there were more female horses on the pages than female humans. But it wasn't all football. But anyway, so we haven't really sorted out the sports media. But we have got 50-something women on telly. We have got, women's football more in the mainstream. So that's all good.
So, Steph, I'm going to ask you a big question.
Go on forever. Sorry, go for it.
No. And it's fantastic that you talk about the experience that has brought to life your 40th year. But I'm going to give you a gift. Every guest gets a gift. We're going to give you the gift of being Prime Minister for the day. What are you going to change? And why are you going to change it? And will you have a 50-metre swimming pool at number 10? Because if you are, I'm coming.
There's just no doubt there would have to be an incredible swimming pool. I'm not sure 50 metres would fit in the back garden, but I'd 25.
Mel will be voting for you. Yeah, Mel will be voting for you on that basis alone, Steph.
Yeah, and free access to Mel.
Yes, thank you.
Only because I wanted to more stuff. Otherwise, I get lane rage. Otherwise. So, yeah, that's such a great question, isn't it? And obviously I should know the answer. I mean, I could very quickly enact anti-misogyny laws because we've got them sort of written up by Helen Kennedy. Everyone knows what we ought to be doing. So we'd bring those in, 3 or 4 very specific laws around misogyny, which is unique in terms of the oppression of women, and it's not about sex-based hate crime, but is about misogyny. That would be a nice broad thing. I would make sure that all government departments were, well, I'd make sure that across government, we were spending taxpayers' money equally to the benefit of men and to women. And so to make up for the fact that the prison budget is spent 90-something%, 96% on men, other departments might spend well more on women. And, if you take, obviously, DCMS and sport, there would need to be probably more than 50% of government investment, public investment, into female sports. So that would have to be tracked through, gender budgeting. I would make it a requirement of any publicly funded body that they had an aim of 50% women on boards and in their senior teams. Whether or not they'd have to do that through quotas, it'd be up to them. They could do it their own way, but it would be monitored and they would be questioned as to why they hadn't. And although we'd have by then anti-misogyny laws, I would also expect all organisations to have anti-misogyny policies, just like they have anti-racism policies or bullying and harassment policies. So, we'd definitely get all that in place straight away. And a requirement on public service broadcasters to equalise the coverage of male and female sport by minute. And
I like that specificity, Steph. I'm loving this.
And probably to just look at the nature of that as well and have some kind of little bit of oversight of the nature of that. We'd also introduce independent regulation for sport so that women and girls facing abuse and children, I should say, women and children facing abuse in sport had an independent place to report that rather than basically not really being able to report it at all.
So, Steph, what strikes me?
That's my agenda when should I run Prime Minister?
I vote Steph. I vote Steph. Steph.
But also with the swimming pool, yeah.
And
yes.
The quick question I have.
Sorry, can you just say one more thing I do? I would clean up our rivers and seas by just basically,
Amen to that, yeah.
I won't say by rejoining the EU, but obviously it bloody helped when we had the threat of sanctions by being in the EU, and it was mental to leave that. But, profound, massive efforts on water quality.
And just a final kind of question. Yeah.
I'm dying to do it.
And a final question, Steph, because, it's very clear that we know what to do just from that list that you very articulately shared with us, right?
Yeah.
So do you think that if we actually really invested in these things, because everyone says, yeah, they're great, aren't they? But, we have to do this, we have to do that. Do you think that if we did seriously invest more equally in women and girls around this whole agenda, I'm particularly thinking about sport, I guess, and some of where the sort of the funding is kind of flowing from. Do you think we would be able to more quickly make some of these changes? Because I'm sure most people wouldn't argue against the things you're suggesting. Do you think that with more parity of funding for women and girls, we would be able to make these changes much more quickly?
I think it would definitely accelerate it. I mean, we saw that with the Title IX rule. I know it wasn't great for women's coaching in some ways, but it did accelerate progress in the States in many ways. But I think if there's an expectation that funding's there and people go, my goodness, it's there. Initially, you could say that in some aspects we're not investment ready, but I think if you look at it through the lenses I was talking about, I think you'd get there relatively quickly. I mean, with implementing gender budgeting, you'd have to do that over a period of years. But it would help to shift the dial, and the mere statement of intent would help to shift the dial.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you have a piece of advice to any woman that's listening to this, it's all well and good, you lot are all right. What would your nugget and your advice be to any woman listening to this to say, be active because it's an amazing thing that you can do?
Well, you see, the interesting thing is I'm not sure I'd target the women. I would say to women, yes, it is a bit shit, isn't it, that you've been given all this responsibility and it's not fair. You need to know it's not fair. Be confident it isn't fair. Be confident in your right to actually have a bit of joy. Be confident in your right that you deserve to have some fun, some freedom, to get on your bike, to sail down the road, to jump in the lake and have a great swim. Be confident in your rights to that. Be confident in the fact that society's got it wrong. And I would say to many, given my kids, just start doing a bit more washing up, taking a bit more. It's not that hard.
Oh, Steph, I love that. Brilliant. Your one piece of advice to women. And of course, I'm going to do a complete media journo thing is cut it in half and say, women, ask the men in your life to do more washing up.
Do you know what? They might actually do the washing up. Maybe we should pick another one. They don't do more washing up.
Washing. What about the washing?
Laundry
Yes.
they do. But then there's always the problem. They're going to put the darks in with the whites. But anyway, that's
Exactly.
mean and sexist. Sorry. I mean, I think it's just share the responsibility. Share the responsibility for the elderly, for the young, for life, and then we'll be happy.
Yeah, absolutely. And what a brilliant way to kind of end, Steph. It's been a pleasure, as always. Love what you're doing. Keep fighting the good fight. And I think Mel and I are definitely voting for you for Prime Minister. Mel because of the swimming pool, and me because you've got your agenda already set and you're ready to go. So thank you.
Great to talk to you both.
Yeah, I'm quite clearly shallow. That's where you get your vote. Holly's got a lot more principles than me. I just want to be that kid that wasn't a geek, that was just generally somebody who thrives. So thank you for that gift.
Last bit is obviously get involved with her spirit, because I do mean that. I literally, when I think of you both, I visualise myself diving into the Attenborough Lake. So you just keep going with it. It's amazing.
Thanks,
all right.
Thank you. Thanks for your support.
Thank you, Steph.
Bye then. Bye.
What an amazing conversation with Steph. I love her humour, and it's good to know that when you had your knickers incident, you survived it and you weren't too emotionally scarred by it. So congratulations, Holly.
Thank you very much. Obviously sharing my deep experiences of being young, female, and trying to kind of play sports. It was a really interesting conversation with Steph. I said it in the podcast and I really meant it. I think where she's taken women in sport over the last 5 years is quite phenomenal. I think she said herself, the journey that women's sport has gone on, it's now in the room. I think women's sport is definitely in the room. I think there's work to be done on actually how fast the steps now can be taken to actually grow women's sport. I think she was quite clear about that. I love the fact that we asked her for Prime Minister what were the one thing she would do, and I think she pretty much gave us probably a 5-year roadmap. So it just shows you the depth of thought that's going into how do we actually level the playing field for women and girls in the whole sporting arena.
Yeah, and it's a journey that she's been on, isn't it, with women in sport, of where it was to where it is and now, and you obviously kind of talked about that. But it's something that I'm interested that she was happy to be able to put a 50-metre swimming pool in for me. She was happy to then be able to go swimming with me. So personally, I would say vote Steph Hilbourne for Prime Minister, and I will share my lane with anybody that is prepared to swim with me.
We're going to do a running count, I think, on how many people, as Prime Minister, are prepared to put a 50-metre swimming pool in for you. So I think it might be 2-0 at the moment. I think it might 2-2 to the swimming pool. So going well. But no, really important conversation. I think Steph has a really good grasp of what's happening at that systemic level around the different policies and strategies. I was quite struck by two things, actually. One of the things she said, which was about men being allies and probably the key now to actually unlocking the further progress and growth of women's sport. And on the other side of the coin, she talked about the necessity to have some kind of misogyny kind of laws in place, which I thought was quite fascinating. There's a really big emphasis on the role that men play, and certainly the decades that I've been involved in women and women's sport, it's been predominantly women that have been championing these causes. I think her vision around actually it's really all about the men now is quite an interesting one.
It is, and it's something that we've been obviously very passionate about from day one. Both our non-exec directors and from day one, Chris Brindley and Ian Philby, were men. And I know from the conversations that I've had with Ian was if we're to solve any problem, and in this instance it's women's physical activity levels, we need 100% gender pool and support, because we need to think and we need to deliver in a way. So yeah, good on you, Steph. I know that the celebrations this year were a lot of men in the room to passionately help solve that problem, and I think it's a very powerful thing to take everybody with you.
Yeah, great conversation, and I'm sure we'll talk more to Steph in the future.